Hi, welcome to this very special edition of The Slot. Today, we'll be debating a very topical motion, and that is generative AI already enhances the delivery of legal services and will revolutionize it within the next decade. That's the motion, and I have two very, very special guests who are going to pit their wits, experiences, and beliefs against each other on this topic. So, for the nays, we have Brian Inkster, who runs a top law firm in Scotland and is a blogger and frequent commentator on all things legal. He's been called a one-man Scottish legal institution, and he is known for his skepticism about shiny new things, though he has been known to appear at conferences as a metallic robot. For the yays, we have the incredible Nikki Shaver. Nikki is, well, what is she not? She's a founder, law professor, advisor on legal innovation, investor, and an all-round distinguished woman of legal tech, and those are not but just my words. She's based in New York, which is probably as culturally different as Brian's Glasgow, as you might hope to find.
Maybe not that different, because they do use Glasgow as Old New York from time to time. It was a film set for Indiana Jones's latest film, for the Return of the Moon landing, and the ticker tape parade through New York in 1969 was filmed just outside our office in Glasgow.
Ah, that's so cool. I didn't know that. I've also never been to Glasgow, but I did used to live in Toronto, which also is frequently used as a film set for New York. So maybe it's that New York just has, multiple faces that can be represented throughout the world.
Indeed.
I see a cultural connection forming here already. I think you guys have to visit each other. So, amazing. So, I could not think of better guests to vehemently but politely debate each other on this hottest of topics. So, the debate is going to take the form of 3 questions, and Nicola and Brian will each have a chance to put forward their view and to respond to each other. So, without further ado, here we go. Question 1. The short view. Is genAI already useful, or is it still just a toy? I'm going to put this first to Nikki.
Yes, I'm going to say yes, generative AI is already useful in lots of different ways. So I think you have to separate it between generative AI off the shelf in the market generally, ChatGPT. Shortly after it had launched, something like 2/3 of all white-collar workers, at least in the United States, had already used ChatGPT, and I would say that number is now closer to 100%. And people are using it for all kinds of things. So if you're using foundational models or chatbots off the shelf, people are using it in their daily life all the time to help them write first drafts of blogs, refine the writing that they do, refine their emails, brainstorm and add to creativity, turn one output into a different output. It's being built into generic products that we use all the time, enabling us to, for example, quite quickly turn written language into PowerPoint presentations or bullet points into Excel documents, which is a huge time saver. And in the legal space, when you look at domain-specific LLMs or solutions that have already been launched, there are a number of ways in which they are already impactful, not in complex legal tasks, perhaps, but certainly in terms of improving the administrative aspects of legal work. I think it would be very difficult to argue that these solutions are not already having an impact and making people's lives a little bit easier. Who hasn't turned to ChatGPT to ask it a question or two during their life in the last year?
Brian, what do you think?
I think there's a difference between generally useful and actually useful, and especially when it comes to day-to-day work as a lawyer. I wouldn't disagree that ChatGPT and generative AI has its uses on a general basis, and some of the things that Nicola mentioned, such as brainstorming and so on, are things that you can see it has a use for it in a search type context, where you would use it as a more advanced, perhaps, use of the Google that we were once used to. But when it comes to actually using it in your day-to-day work as a lawyer, I think it becomes very limited what you would actually use it for. The other week, I posed in a blog post, what are the use cases? And I've thrown it out there and asked, let us know what this magic can actually do in a law firm, and I'll give you a magic wand as a prize if you come up with one. We got, after a lot of interaction in that blog post on LinkedIn, over 60,000 views at the moment, over 100 interactions and comments. We came up with three people that had use cases of a sort, 2.5 wands being given out, and the use cases were pretty poor. One person said the use case was producing drafts of documents when you didn't have a template bank yourself. Well, that's as good as ChatGPT actually has templates available that have been online that it's been able to scrape, unless you're applying it to your own law firm's bank, in which case there'll be other ways and means of accessing that than using ChatGPT. For example, just yesterday, I was looking for a document which I couldn't easily find for a particular style, and I thought, well, I'll try ChatGPT, see if it came up with a style. It came up with a reference to a link which I could use for this style. It couldn't produce the document. It linked me to Practical Law, which is a paywall, because you have to pay for Practical Law. It had the document I was looking for, but behind a paywall. So immediately ChatGPT wasn't able to produce this style I didn't have. I had to have a Practical Law subscription to get it. I contacted a colleague who was able to send it to me very quickly. So it doesn't follow that ChatGPT is an answer to missing style banks. Another potential use that was given was to translate legalese into simple language. And I think lawyers should be doing that as a matter of course without having to run what they do through ChatGPT. And my problem is I just can't really find anything on a day-to-day basis that I do in my office or that other lawyers do in our office that ChatGPT is going to add anything to at all.
So if I can respond to that, first of all, the question was, is it generally useful? So I wasn't responding in terms of how would it be useful in legal work. And I think when you look at it in the context of legal work, you're not talking about ChatGPT, right? You're talking about large language model technology, perhaps generative AI, that is leveraged for use particularly in law firms. And if you are looking at that, there are all kinds of use cases. And I think they will continue to build as this technology is built into different products. So for example, a targeted search. Generative AI is not search. It's not searching in the same way a Google searches, although I'm sure Google is building this type of technology into its backend as well. It actually generates new content. It doesn't search and then display results, but for search and retrieval in a targeted database, it's outstanding. For the drafting of simple documents like memos or letters, it's phenomenal. Of course, you would edit those, but to come up with a first draft of something very, very quickly, it's able to do that more rapidly than technology we've seen before. For legal research, where it is focused on a database of legal content and has been reinforced with sound, structured legal content, it is able to provide results and explainability and a memo that is a first draft rapidly. It's able to summarize large legal documents and sets of legal documents effectively when it has been trained, again, on sound legal content. It's able to translate documents from one language into any other language, which is particularly useful if you're working on cross-border matters. It is able to do targeted contract review. So if, say, you want to find all of the termination clauses within a set of documents, it can pull those. Where previous AI or machine learning technology required training in order to identify clauses, this type of technology generally does not, or if it does, it's like 1 or 2 clauses rather than 250, which some of the previous technologies required. It's able to do redlining, not just simple redlining, but redlining against anything. So in the contract space, it's being used to redline incoming contracts against your own playbooks so that you can identify where within the contract you should focus your negotiation. It's able to interrogate a set of documents. So if you have a set of case law or you have a database and you want to ask questions in terms of what is in those documents, you're able to do that and get really accurate results.
Nikki,
In
I'm
jurisdictions
fearing,
where
Nikki, I'm
gonna run
worried
out
that
of
you've got
time.
this list that's going to carry on and on. I mean, that's amazing because
stop.
you're reeling off a really impressive list of use cases. So I just want to give Brian a very quick opportunity to comment on what you've said.
Although that sounds like an impressive list of things, when you actually look what lawyers do in most offices on a day-to-day basis, they're mostly processing a transaction from start to finish. And a lot of the things that Nicola has just referred to are not things that would necessarily be stuff that they would be dealing with on a day-to-day basis in the work that they do. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And I think a lot of this is taking out of context what someone actually, how they do their job on a day-to-day basis, and at what points in their day doing their job would an LLM actually be of use to them. And if you break down, which I've tried to do, the processes we have in our office and that our solicitors do and our support staff do in order to move something on from A to B to C to D, most of that we can do very well with advanced document automation that we have in use in our office that we've been perfecting for many years. And there's nothing that I can see that we are doing on a day-to-day basis that generative AI can really add to that. And I believe that most law firms have really ignored document automation for years, not done anything with it, and jumping on a generative AI bandwagon thinking that's going to solve their problems is not going to work, because there's so much existing technology that they can put in place and make work that would do them so much better than looking at this shiny new toy that's not really going to achieve very much for them in the long term.
Thank you, Brian.
Can I have one rebuttal to that?
Go on then.
Dennis? I'll keep it short, I promise.
Just for you, Nikki.
Just to say, document automation has not had as much traction as it should have in law firms because it's very difficult to adopt. I completely agree with Brian that any technology, including this technology, has to be built into lawyer workflows in order to be useful, and firms have to be doing that work. But adding generative AI to document automation will have an improved outcome and likely will make it easier for lawyers to adopt.
And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but we need to get the document automation working before we add the generative AI in where it might help. And I think that's a huge hill for most lawyers and most law firms to climb.
So we could, of course, I'm sure Nikki has all sorts of responses to that, and Brian has many rebuttals, but we are limited in time, so we are going to have to move on. But maybe an observation from my side. I think the distinction between ChatGPT and deeper kind of AI systems, I think, is relevant. I think there's clearly a journey between use cases and then real embedment and real usefulness of those use cases in law firms, and perhaps it is a journey and it's a question of time, which is a perfect segue to our second question. And the second question is taking the long view, and that is generative AI yet another hype cycle, like we saw with blockchain, the metaverse, Web3, or is it different this time? And this time, Brian, you go first.
I think it is to an extent, but not as completely as we have seen with metaverse and blockchain in law. I think the difference is that generative AI is being made more accessible to everyone, and we will find that it is in things that we use every day. So now if you use Bing, it pops up with a ChatGPT function. Maybe not a lot of people probably used Bing before, but I believe more are using it since ChatGPT featured in it, and no doubt Google will be featuring something similar. With Microsoft planning to introduce generative AI features within the Microsoft suite, we will see people using it as part of that software. And I think that's quite different from the metaverse and blockchain, where it was something, well, the metaverse, for example, was something you had to go and hunt out and put on goggles and enter. It wasn't something that you were just faced with, and we're going to be faced with generative AI in lots of different applications. So I think from that point of view, it's not a fad that's going to go away. It'll stay, but I don't think its impact is going to be as great as being made out at the moment within law, in the same way as a year or so ago we were hearing that the metaverse was going to change the way we were going to practice law, and that never happened. Generative AI may assist in small ways, but I don't think it's going to be as impactful as we are being led to believe.
Nicola, over to you.
So, I mean, certainly Brian and I are on the same page when we look at the inaccessibility of blockchain and metaverse. I think this comparison has been made a number of times, and it doesn't make a ton of sense. Blockchain was not adopted widely, partly because it's a distributed network, which requires that many legal organizations adopt it in order for it to have any impact, which is very different from generative AI, which can have an impact individually in any one firm. And the metaverse, again, there are barriers to entry, and it doesn't really solve a problem we're currently having. I think one of the things that makes this really different, and something that I think we have to see as a feature and an exciting aspect of this new technology, is the fact that it's got lawyers really excited. One of the great difficulties with any sort of legal technology is encouraging lawyers to use it and adopt it. And I know from personal experience, having tried to, spent 10 years driving adoption of technology in law firms, that it's an uphill battle. And for the first time, everyone I speak to has their partners, their lawyers, their people clamoring to use this technology. That's an amazing opportunity, not just for the use of generative AI specifically, but for automation technology and the way that we will operate in law firms. This is the time to strike now. Similar to the pandemic, it's kind of an inflection point in more ways than one. It gives us the opportunity to drive these initiatives forward where perhaps they would have stalled. And I do think that actually this makes things possible that previously simply were not possible. And in that way, it is quite different from what has come before. And I do think it's genuinely useful within legal practice. But I also will say something similar to what Casey Flaherty said a number of months ago, which is if you look at ChatGPT, it's the appetizer. The main course is on its way. This technology is evolving incredibly quickly. We're seeing things like Auto GPT, sort of automated processes from end to end that are going to be made feasible by this type of technology. And we don't really know where it's going beyond that. But when we're looking at the impact, I think we're not just looking at this moment in time. We're looking at this exponential development of technology and what that's likely to mean 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Brian, what do you say to that?
It's always 5 years. It's always 5 years or 10 years. The reality might be 30 or to 50 years. I think we will see in 5 to 10 years' time there'll not be that much difference. There usually isn't. And we tend to overestimate what's going to happen in the short term and underestimate what's going to happen in the long term. And in the world of legal tech predictions, it's usually 5 years. 5 years ago, we were predicting huge things in AI, I was at conferences 5 years ago where AI was the big thing, and people were saying it was going to transform the way we work. We've seen the headlines from 5 years ago, from 10 years ago about robots and law. So we get this every 5 years or so, but I don't think we're going to see anything hugely transformative in 5 years' time. We might in a longer term. And whilst it's easy for people to say this is just the start and the technology is going to get better, it may well get better, but it may get worse. There is schools of thought that say that the garbage that generative AI is spilling out and creating and adding to the internet is just going to make things worse in the long term. So there's different schools of thought on that, and it does hallucinate, as we know, and it seems to be suddenly that it's acceptable to use a technology that lies to you, and that to me just seems strange, that people are willing to suddenly, especially lawyers, are willing to say, that's okay. Junior associates might get things wrong. It's okay for generative AI to get things wrong as well. And I think there's a huge curve for us to get over there as far as how good this technology is actually going to be to us, and should we be using technology that creates garbage as a judge, or gibberish was the word, gibberish as a judge in the United States said.
I'd love to ask you, the timeline. Do you agree with Brian on the timeline? And do you think, are there inherent limitations in the technology around accuracy, around the sort of availability of real rather than synthetic data, that is going to require some other leap of technology to really make GenAI useful?
So on the timeline, I do think, I agree with you. We have seen these cycles before. I think this is different. Pretty much anyone who used ChatGPT, and especially used GPT 4.0, could tell this is different than what we've seen before. I think it will have a bigger impact sooner than what we've had previously, partly as well because, as I've said, there is enthusiasm generally about the take-up of it. But I also must say I'm an optimist. I do think to work in legal innovation, you have to be an optimist. There are inherent limitations to the technology off the shelf, and any technology is better if it is added to other types of technology. The best solutions we're seeing right now are additive. They're ones that are drawing on different types of machine learning, as well as other types of technology in order to produce something that is robust and genuinely useful in the legal environment. When you look at the way that law firms are working with these tools, aside from a few who are doing some centralized workshops around ChatGPT itself, most of the firms that are really getting use from it already are those that have taken the technology and then either they're leveraging something that is domain specific for law, where some of those limitations have been minimized through architecture in the back end, or they're doing something a little bit similar themselves. So you're able to point the technology at a particular set of documents and then obtain responses that are contextualized for that data set rather than drawing from the entire internet of, some good, some really bad content. And so that sort of targeted impact, I think, is what we need to look at when we're asking whether this is useful in the legal environment. This retrieval augmented generation as opposed to just domain specific. And those tools have also allowed for showing sources so that you know exactly where a response is coming from, sometimes showing those in a prioritized order, linking back to the source. So you get around some of the limitations that Brian has pointed out.
Brian, what do you think about those aspects? I mean, I'm hearing, additive versus off the shelf, minimizing limitations. Are these the answers to making this useful?
I think Nicola did a post herself, I believe, at some point in the past that said that limiting the data that an LLM was working on wouldn't necessarily stop it from hallucinating. and that the software effectively will hallucinate regardless of the data that it's working on. There are, I believe, ways that you can try and limit that with guardrails and so on, which is all probably too technical for me to give any great opinion on. But a lot of the things that Nicola's saying are things that big law firms can probably spend time and effort on doing. Most small law firms and lawyers working as solo or small firms aren't going to be able to do those sorts of things. At some point, there might be software they can buy off the shelf that will do it for them. But at the moment, that's not something that they can spend time and energy doing. And the excitement that Nicola says there is in law about generative AI is probably not that dissimilar from the excitement we saw about the metaverse and we saw about Clubhouse and things like that. There's a bit of excitement because it's in the news and people are hyping it up. That's where the excitement is. I think if you went into most law firms and spoke to most lawyers who are working day in, day out, doing the work that they have been doing, they're not excited at all by it. They just want to get their job done during the day. They're working away at their work. They're not suddenly saying we must have generative AI to help us do our tasks. And if generative AI was produced to them, the chances of them using it would probably be small to remote to non-existent.
That's actually not true. I've spent the last month speaking to many, many, many law firms and presenting to many law firms, including to managing partners, partners across offices, groups of 300 people showing up to a CLE session because they are so interested in what is happening. And I have first-hand accounts of innovation teams being inundated by requests from lawyers to please allow them to use it, requests from lawyers asking, what are we doing with this? We need to be using this. I know of firms that have deployed their own fine-tuned version of an LLM chatbot internally where they are getting high usage from lawyers and very keen interest in understanding it better and leveraging it within their own workflows. So I really disagree that the enthusiasm is limited and that maybe there is a difference between what's happening in large law and what's happening in other types of legal environments, but certainly within large law and also within larger corporate legal departments, there is enormous interest right now in actually using it within legal workflows, as well as all of the potential opportunities on the operational and business side, which we haven't addressed but are phenomenal.
Can I just get, I think that those are really different perspectives, different views, and that's what we're here for, to hear those out. Can I just ask each of you to answer perhaps in just one sentence, is AI going to be impactful because it's going to be a small cog in an otherwise larger machine, and that machine is made to work and AI enhances it? Or do you think that generative AI will be not just a small cog, it will be a massively a key part of it, or impactful in its own right? Maybe Brian, you can give us a view on that.
Maybe a small part in a big cog. As we touched on earlier, it may be that generative AI added on to document automation will improve document automation, for example. But I think there's so much technology and existing technology that solicitors can use better and more fully than generative AI at the moment. And a lot of what Nicola is speaking about is really just experimentation at the moment.
I'm going to say both, actually. I think it will play a very significant role being built into many other solutions where it will be a small to medium cog of those solutions. But I also think we've seen an unusual number of firms move very quickly to adopt AI legal assistance, and that is generative AI, pure and simple, with big cogs, certainly, in those solutions. And I think that will continue. I think that's a new category of technology that we'll see law firms use. So I'm seeing both.
Amazing. Okay, wonderful. I'm going to move on straight to the next, the third question. So we looked at the short view, we looked at the long view. So in the meantime, what do people do? So there's one particular question that I'd like to tackle. So for legal teams or law firms who side with Nicola rather than Brian, or maybe side with Brian but still want to experiment, should they buy or should they build their own? Nikki, perhaps you can start.
If I was at a firm right now, I would be doing everything from an experimental perspective. The one thing I probably would not be doing is spending millions of dollars on one investment into a single solution, because I think the dust hasn't settled on this. Things are moving too quickly, and you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket. What I would be doing is piloting many different solutions, LexisNexis AI, Thomson Reuters case text, Microsoft Copilot when it becomes available, and some firms are already working with it. I would also be looking at leveraging foundational LLMs in secure sandboxes in order to really understand the potential for operational transformational projects and internal use cases. And ideally, and this again is dependent on having an engineering team or the resources to be able to hire consultants to support it. But a number of firms have had the engineering resources to do it themselves, taking either a foundational model or a legal domain specific model and fine tuning it on your own data model so that lawyers internally are able to use it securely and understand the ways in which it would become genuinely applicable within lawyer workflows. And the reason that a lot of firms are doing that, they're not building an entire large language model, they're fine tuning large language models with their own data, so that it's not chat GPT responses, it is responses that make sense in the context of their environment, so that they can also see how that's useful within their environment. And I think firms should be experimenting like that right now. It is a time for experimenting, and in order to identify your use cases, you really need to be deploying the technology in a way that allows your lawyers to play with it. So I think they should be doing both, actually.
Brian, do you have a view on this?
Most law firms don't have the resources to do this. Most law firms are not Thomson Reuters, LexisNexis, or Microsoft, and let those firms do it, and then buy what they've got, or you probably won't be buying it as such if it gets incorporated within your Microsoft suite that you're using. It'll just be part and parcel of what you use. Lots of case management systems link in with Microsoft, and chances are that they will link in with whatever Microsoft is producing on that front. And for most law firms, that's the way to go. Suggesting that you should spend time developing your own system, to my mind, is just a nonsense. We've seen the disasters of that with the likes of ClearSpire and Atrium building their own technology, where they were really just building something that already existed rather as actually building anything new. Let the people who can spend the money on legal technology build the solutions that we need, and then let's use them when they're being perfected, in the knowledge that those firms can keep that technology updated and keep it up to date all the time in a way that a law firm just wouldn't be able to do.
This is the fun skeptic, as I like to call Brian, one of several. It's a very sound, sensible answer, and for a lot of law firms, that's probably correct. I will say it costs less and it takes less time to do this than one would expect, and it is in fact accessible, I would say, to many firms who might not think they were able to develop something like this internally. Again, it's not building something from scratch. It's really taking an existing solution. So there are now a number of providers that have actually already done the work of reinforcing a foundational LLM with legal content, taking that and then fine-tuning it with your data model, which allows you to leverage it in a way that makes your own data and your own context-specific information accessible through the technology. Given the way that lawyers work, that's extremely useful, and it's a real differentiator from other types of builds we've seen internally, where it's just about building something, for example, a matter management system, where perhaps that might have existed in third-party off-the-shelf solutions. And if there's really not a strategic advantage to building, I agree you shouldn't. In this case, there is a strategic advantage, which is you're leveraging your own data in order to enhance the functionality of the technology.
Brian, do you have anything that you'd want to say in response? You don't have to.
I don't think there's anything that I've not already said. I think I would just stand by the view that you shouldn't build your own, let others that know better build it for you. We are law firms, lawyers, we're not technology firms. Let the technology firms do the technology that we can then use.
All right. Unfortunately, those technology firms don't have access to your data. So I think that's where it falls down.
But that they can create technology that the firms can use on their own data in the same way as firms produce case management firms that work on the firm's data. They don't have access to the data, but they produce software that's able to work with the data, and that's no different from using LLMs. There's absolutely no argument that a law firm needs to create an LLM themselves so that it can work on their own data when a technology firm can produce it to run on their own data.
Well, I mean,
Perhaps you're not so far
we might be
apart
saying the
because-
same thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I think you're not far apart. You're talking about domain-specific LLMs. Perhaps on this, you're not as far apart on others. But we do need to move on because time is running. So I'm going to ask you the final thoughts, and I'd like you to respond very shortly to the following question. How many lawyers will AI replace in 10 years' time? Nikki.
Oof. I know you want a simple answer to this one, Dennis. I think, Goldman Sachs estimated that 44% of legal work would be fully automated. Three Geeks in a Law, Brian from Sente Advisors has estimated at closer to 23.5%. I think we're going to see large law firms in particular hiring fewer summer associates and fewer graduate lawyers, perhaps moving from, say, 100 or 120 each year to closer to 70 or 80. So I do think that it will have some sort of an impact and reduce perhaps the incoming workforce by about 20%. On the other hand, I think there will be all kinds of opportunities for lawyers that didn't exist before. So we'll see lawyers working in different types of roles and organizations.
Interesting. Brian, what's your view on this?
Zero, but if you ask the question how many jobs will it generate for lawyers, probably a lot, because there'll be a lot of litigation arising out of the use of AI, and there'll be lots of work for lawyers dealing with all the litigation that comes out of it, as there is already. And any technology historically has not reduced the number of lawyers. Email's not reduced the number of lawyers. Lots of technology that's come along, just computers, the internet, everything has sped up our lives and made us, if anything, more active. There was something that someone commented on one of my blog posts about how historically we had contracts that were a few pages long. Now they're 50 or 60 pages long. The ability to have technology create more for us is just generating more, not less. And I think that trend will continue. And I don't think we will end up with generative AI taking away any jobs. It'll probably just create jobs.
Can I ask a question, Dennis?
You can.
Brian, do you think that there will be increased roles for other types of professionals in law firms over time?
Like, for example, is this through generative AI, people that would use?
not just generative AI, but technology generally. Data analysts, project managers, legal technologists who are able to leverage data and content within it.
Potentially. I mean, I created the first role for and title for a legal process engineer. That term had never been used before I used it first. And we've got a legal process engineer in our office. We've had one for a good few years now. Purely looking at our processes and using technology to make things more efficient for all the lawyers that work with us. And that's really looking at our existing technology and our case management systems and doing that. You know, most law firms don't have people like that employed in them. I'm not running a huge law firm, I'm running a small law firm. But even large law firms usually don't have people of that ilk working in them to the same extent that our legal process engineer does. And I think there's a lot of talk about all these different types of lawyer. In Richard Susskind's Tomorrow's Lawyers, he had a whole list of them, and that list seems to be getting bigger and bigger each time he publishes a new edition. Although he doesn't seem to have caught up with the legal process engineer yet, even though that's been out for a good few years. So there's this list, but I'm not really seeing that as being some fundamental thing that's changing law in any way. I think we've seen new roles and we've seen the development of new roles, but I can't see that being something that's going to be overly transformative.
So that's to me where I think there will be a huge difference into the future. I think we're going to see many more of these types of roles, and in fact, in large law, there are a large number of these roles now. So certainly in the U.S., and my understanding was that in the UK even more so, there are all kinds of roles that are similar to your process engineer, legal process engineer, knowledge engineer, data analyst. We're seeing all kinds of titles proliferate and innovation departments grow substantially to support not just internal legal work, but also client work, and subsidiaries as well proliferate to, again, support client consulting work in a very technologically driven, technologically enabled way. And I think that's what we'll really see, is that legal teams of the future will generally include not just lawyers, but these other types of roles as well, because legal services will be deployed innately, tied and bundled with technology services. So that's my view of the future, rather than cutting down specifically on the number of lawyers. It will change the way that we look at legal teams.
I think this is really interesting. I mean, obviously, Nikki, you're saying that AI will reduce intake, but there'll be other jobs added on top, so perhaps it will remain steady. Brian, sounds like you think, if anything, there's going to be additional jobs to manage this technology and also to manage the sort of the effects and impacts of that technology. Nikki, you believe that there are going to be real impacts within the next 5-10 years. Brian, you're sort of putting it at a kind of 30 to 50 year scale. One of the key things also I would take away is that, Brian, you're not a technology or an innovation skeptic at all. In fact, you are, like the rest of us, also an innovator, perhaps with a slightly more skeptical glance than Nikki's optimism. But this has been amazing. Our time is up. I wanted to say thank you so much for agreeing to come on and to debate this topic on the slot. Perhaps we'll do this again another time with more time. But in the meantime, I was going to end with some AI jokes. May I?
Please.
You're going to have. So the first one was, which I think is actually very apropos to what we were talking about. Why won't AI ever replace senior partners? Because it's not designed to be useless. That's the first one. Second, why aren't boats equipped with artificial intelligence? Nobody wants to get on a thinking ship. And finally, just to close off, in this, we live in crazy times. So did you know Old MacDonald's farm has been taken over by artificial intelligence? AI, AIO.
Ah, that's a good one.
On that happy note, thank you so much again. It's been really wonderful. Really appreciate you. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.